Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Today's forever friend should have his name changed to Barnabas. Barnabas, you may remember, is the word or the name which means son of. That's what Bar, like Simon Bar Joseph, is the Simon, the son of Joseph. Bar means son of. So Barnabas is son of Nabas. Nabas is the Hebrew word for encouragement. That's why I gave my precious wife as my first nickname for her, Bat Nabas, which means daughter of encouragement. Well, this fella that I'm talking about today should be called Barabbas, because he has been in my life in times of insecurity, uncertainty, wrestling with a sense of failure and a failure to accomplish much. This particular forever friend consistently spoke into my life words of encouragement. Now, some of those words of encouragement were something like this. You know that book you talked about last week? I'd never read it before, but I started it and I'm being helped by it. Or it might be, you know, that movie that you recommended. I remember watching that all these years ago, and I remember how much it meant to me, and your discussion of it just sort of brought all that back to me. I'm talking about Steve Hoskins. That's his name. And I have mentioned him obliquely in the past, because when I come onto the podcast and when I ask for feedback, I often mention the fact that there's one person I can count on to bring feedback. That's important. I don't remember if Steve and I have ever met face to face, but not only does he encourage me today, but he encouraged me 15 and 20 years ago. That's saying something. He said, I connected with you back when you were doing the basement tapes, and then I did that for a while, and then when you started Jesus Changes Everything the first time, and now you can have it back again, and he stuck with us and it, and with his good habit of writing words of encouragement now for the we're heading on to year 3, or to the end of year 3. It will come in July, I think. So we're getting, or more than 2.5 years into the Jesus Changes Everything Part 2 podcast. And Steve is still there. I want you to remember, and let me encourage you, as I always do at the end of these segments, that when I encourage you to reach out to someone maybe that you've lost contact with, it doesn't have to be someone you've lost contact with. It doesn't have to be someone that you gave thanks for who was a part of your life 20 or 40 or 50 years ago. It could be someone who's a part of your life right now. And let them know that you appreciate them. I appreciate Steve. I appreciate him, again, not only because he gives words of encouragement, but because he does engage. He does, he listens carefully. He thinks about what he's hearing. He reads on his own very carefully. And so it's not some sort of silly girl screaming, Bobby Soxer screaming for Frank Sinatra. This is thoughtful engagement. And there are times even when we disagree. And every time that happens, Steve responds with deep grace and kindness and patience. That's the kind of friend I want to be. And that's another way that he blesses me, by being for me just a wonderful example. Me coming on the podcast and saying, hey, why don't you encourage somebody? Or, hey, why don't you send me an email and let me know what you're thinking? Why don't you interact, leave a comment? That is not the same thing as me being the kind of person who does those things. But it ought to be. It ought to mean that about me. And I'm learning, and I'm growing, and I'm maturing. Well, Steve is out in front of me by far on this count, and he has a deep gift. There are others who have similar gifts as well. In fact, I would venture to guess that encouragement, just like having fun and having a great smile are things that I've cherished on so many of the friends that I've talked about. So is this gift of encouragement and this gift of engagement. I don't know if you know Steve. I don't have to work, by the way, to get this to him because he listens faithfully. He's going to hear this. I don't know if you know this fellow. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I hope some of you do, because I hope he's not only telling me, hey, I really enjoy your podcast. I hope he's telling his friends. But if you are one of those friends, you know what I'm talking about. And if you have a friend in your life like Steve, let me again encourage you to thank God for that person's encouragement in your life. And let me encourage you that by God's grace, you go and encourage that encourager. And say, I value how you've interacted in my life. You've made a difference in my life. You've lifted me up when I was down. Steve, that's how I feel. You don't need to respond to this. I know you'll respond to something else soon enough because of your faithfulness. But I want you to know that I am grateful for you. How easily our familiarity with the Bible sets a trap for us. Our eyes run across the page, and we realize we're about to read about the Good Samaritan. We know that story. We race, at best, to get to it, at worst, to get through it. And so we miss what comes before it. Consider the few portentous words out of the mouth of the lawyer who prompted the story. He, you will remember, asked Jesus how he might be saved. Jesus, in turn, asked the lawyer, what is written in the law? The lawyer gives the two great commandments, and Jesus replies, you have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live. Now here comes the telling part. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Isn't that something? He wanted to justify himself. Now, why would that be? The law, of course, condemns us sinners. Sinners that we are, we seek then to blame the law rather than ourselves. We suggest to ourselves either that the law is unclear or unreasonable. We, ironically, seek to law ourselves away from the law. The party of the first part, unable to determine the party of the second part, is hereby absolved of all wrongdoing toward the party of the second part. That's the gist of where this lawyer was going in asking the question, who is my neighbor? What is interesting is that Jesus doesn't tell the lawyer who his neighbor is. He tells the lawyer instead that he, that is Jesus, he is the neighbor. Our attempts at earning God's favor in keeping His law leave us naked, battered, and in desperate need of rescue. Jesus alone can rescue us. He must carry us to safety. He must pay our debts, that our wounds might be healed. And He promises to come back for us. In short, we cannot justify ourselves by asking who is our neighbor. Instead, we can only be justified by the one who is our neighbor. Though the story does not say so, I wouldn't be surprised that when the man was healed sufficiently to go on with his life, he went through his days filled with gratitude for the Samaritan neighbor. I suspect, on the other hand, that he probably remained something like the lawyer. I suspect that he too, from time to time, faced the temptation in the face of the law to justify himself. He, like the lawyer who first asked the question, had a fool for a client. We all do the same. Even we who confess our dependence on the finished work of Christ alone do not always and everywhere, when confronted with the law, rejoice in the provision of the great neighbor. Too often we seek to justify ourselves. We make excuses. We rationalize. We object to the one judge in all the universe who must always judge rightly. We seek to justify ourselves to the one judge in all the universe who wants only one thing of us: that we would repent and believe still more. Friends, the message here is less be a good egg and rescue people who are stranded on the side of the road, and more, I am in a desperate situation, and Jesus is always and everywhere the answer. He has provided for my need, and I no longer seek to do the impossible, to justify myself. Would that we would always have ears to hear. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.